This is Psych Overflow coming to you from the University of Southern California Psychology Department.
We're your go-to podcast for all things psychology.
Welcome, and let's dive in.
All right, guys, I'm back with another podcast on this Friday, first day of March. I will introduce myself briefly. My name is Gabriel Leon. For those of you who don't know, I'm a third year here in the USC Clinical Psychology program. And I have two folks with me today, and I will pass it on to them. Start off with Iony and then Armin. So Iony, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Iony Azawa. I'm an assistant professor in the USC Psychology Department. Very excited to be back.
And my name is Armin. I'm a first year in the Psychology Department, and I'm in the BCS program, Brain and Cognitive Sciences.
Cool. All right, guys. Today's topic of discussion is technology in research. So each of us are kind of at different stages of our academic journeys. We come from different fields a little bit. Iony and I are both in clinical. Armin is in BCS, Brain and Cognitive Sciences. But I think we've all, in some way, shape, or form, sought to integrate tech in our research in one way or the other, or it's a part of our background, perhaps. So I'll open it up to you guys. Is there something currently in your program of research that involves integrating technology for data collection or even analyses? How is it coming up for you guys in your work?
I think the biggest one, and the one that has had like the greatest impact that I've seen on across every discipline, has been, ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of not just ChatGPT itself, but these other kind of models that are kind of running ChatGPT in the back end to do other tasks that researchers or students might find useful. So I know a lot of people use some AI models that use ChatGPT to kind of like summarize papers for them.
Mm-hmm.
I know there are certain models that do literature review for people. I haven't used that myself yet, but I definitely want to, because that just sounds useful.
Hmm. Do you use
Yeah.
ChatGPT regularly in your work? And what are
Yeah.
the best use cases for you?
Yeah, I always have one tab open. That's ChatGPT. And yeah, I guess like I use it for as much as I can use it for. So if I'm, for example, like reading something, like a textbook for a course or papers, it's super useful if like there's a concept that I'm not familiar with, I can ask ChatGPT. And personally, I found that to be actually a bit better than Google at times. I think, if it's something very general and that, you assume that perhaps it's not very like a niche topic,
Mhm.
that you need to kind of go in depth for, I think ChatGPT can be really useful for those types of concepts.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just find it really useful to just chat with ChatGPT about what I'm reading. I've tried to use it before for like research brainstorming.
Mhm.
Like if I have a certain question about a topic, then I'll say like, oh, like, here's what I'm thinking of. This is kind of the trajectory I was thinking of taking this. Give me some examples of how I might do this. And then this is kind of where it starts to get into like the more niche stuff, right? And then this is kind of where you need to be a little bit more like wary of ChatGPT, because at the end of the day, it is a generative AI model,
Mhm.
and it will generate something. That's its job. And so if you're using it for very niche purposes, then you have to be very careful, I think. And another thing that I use it for is coding. So I do quite a bit of coding for my research, and before, I think most people here who have coded have experience with, like Stack Overflow, which is kind of like the podcast inspiration for the name. And yeah, I think like most people who code probably have experience going to Google, saying like, I need to do this in Python, in R, whatever. And you just kind of go to Stack Overflow and see what, the top answer is, basically try to implement that. And ChatGPT is basically like Stack Overflow, but just in one place. And, it's not perfect. You have to be very careful. Again, the more complex the code base gets, I've noticed that I need to like remind ChatGPT about certain things. Like if I introduce a function earlier and then I introduce a new function and I want to like kind of incorporate the two, sometimes it'll just summarize the new function for me, or it'll kind of just like make up variables that don't exist. And then I have to like, remind it and say, hey, no, like use the previous function I told you about. This is how I believe they're connected with one another, but I'd like for you to, give me your suggestions as well.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I was just using ChatGPT yesterday to help me code. And that is actually something that I was noticing as well. But also that it has like these built in assumptions that really, I mean, kind of bring me back, I don't know, to reality sometimes. Like it's not perfect. It's definitely built by humans. And so there are biases kind of sometimes making their way into the, even just like the code that's coming out. Like it's making assumptions that maybe I just don't want the model to be doing in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to be very on top of it with things like that, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but I haven't found a consistent way of integrating ChatGPT into my workflow, primarily because I think, particularly for work when I'm really trying to think through a piece of writing or a research question or data analysis, like I feel like it breaks my concentration because I have to like engineer a prompt and then sift through the output and kind of like glean and then mesh that with what my ideas are. And it's like, I feel like it breaks my concentration. So that's one thing that I've come to struggle with it. However, I think what you talk about with coding, that is one use case that I haven't taken full advantage of. I know like GitHub has their Copilot now and people have like raved about it. I haven't been able to really sit down and get familiar with it. But I think that that would be useful from the people that I talk to. They do transformer based language models, like that's their actual like program of research. We have a lot of folks like that here in our department in Dr. Morteza Degani's lab. Gotten to know some of them, and their opinions seem to be that it's going nowhere, right? I think their opinions seem to be, and I'm summarizing, but the way that we construct papers, language within academics specifically, it's going to be in some way, shape, or form assisted by these types of models, right? Or whatever is going to come after them. So yeah, I don't want to be the old man who's saying, nope, I just need my Microsoft Word and that's all I need, right? I do want to learn to evolve. But any other thoughts, guys, or other ways you've used technology in your work?
I've been very excited about technology and helping with my work and I guess in a lot of different ways. So, I guess in a nutshell, I study the processes by which different therapies for depression achieve their effects. And one thing that I've been really wanting to prioritize in my work is accessibility of these treatments because as we all know, like psychotherapy is really expensive and really hard to come by, like really effective treatment modalities. So I'm actually doing like two randomized controlled trials right now. So one of them is like online therapy groups. So it's like utilizing something basic like, basic now, Zoom. So that's been really neat to do therapy groups. But then we also have another one where we're using the metaverse to have online social support groups that incorporate cognitive behavioral skills. So we actually have people joining these therapy groups from, or I guess like therapeutic intervention type groups from literally all over the world. So that's pretty neat, I think. And then using EMA on the side to help collect intensive data. So
Yeah, I guess coming from the public's perspective, a question that comes to mind, Ione, that people may be interested in is how would the metaverse work for therapy if like, is it just like training people to have social skills in like the virtual world? Or how do we expect that to translate into like real interactions? Because I could see someone saying, well, this is like a fake world. Like, how do you expect this to be useful to people? You're just going to get them used to being online more. What would you speak to that criticism?
yeah, we've actually been thinking a lot about the ethics of this. And so a lot of people that come into these programs are maybe experiencing like social anxiety, for example. And so we wondered, like, is this just another safety behavior? They're receiving an intervention where they're learning skills to get exposed to talking to others, for example. But if it's just a way to kind of prevent that happening from the real world, they feel like they're getting therapy and they're talking with other avatars. Is that actually preventing from, yeah, the next step? But the way I think I'm starting to see it is that maybe this is like the first stepping stone in order to then kind of seek out a higher intensity of treatment out in the real world. But we've actually had experiences where some of our members are able to kind of join from a device on the metaverse and then actually be like taking the steps with people who are on the app and kind of explain like, wow, I'm actually going out of the house for the first time in a long time. I'm actually at the grocery store, but also have the support of someone just literally in the palm of their hand, which is pretty neat. And so we have some initial data suggesting like maybe it actually is going to be helpful, but those ethical questions I think are still in the back of our mind because we really want to make sure that we're not perpetuating any problems.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, Armin, have you done anything similar in your work, or do you have any thoughts about that?
I hadn't thought of it prior to the conversation, but you saying that actually reminded me. So, with my advisor, Payam, we do a lot of work on decision making, and something that him, as well as I think some other people in the area of decision making, are very excited about is using virtual reality and kind of conducting experiments in virtual reality. I think also with some sort of kind of headset that can record, I guess very low level brain activity or high level brain activity. But yeah, it's interesting to see how many people are really adopting like virtual reality and the metaverse, I guess, as a tool for them. I know somebody in the neuroscience department. I think his name is James Finley, maybe,
Hmm.
but he does a lot of research on walking and locomotion. And specifically, he also does some clinical work, kind of helping people who've lost this ability, for one reason or another, to kind of regain the ability to walk. And he does a lot of work in virtual reality as well, kind of like gamifying this sort of task of like bending down and grabbing something. It's all in virtual reality, but you kind of like bend down and grab something. You have to walk to different like corners of a room and kind of solve puzzles. So you're kind of like using your brain and walking at the same time. And it seemed neat. It seemed promising. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for virtual reality specifically in our line of work and in many lines of work as well.
It's so funny how I think both the examples you provided it make me think of uh, virtual reality, or it could be robotics or anything like that. It's kind of serving as a form of scaffolding, right? Well, as people are getting better, right? Like Armin, the example you gave, it's someone like building like neurological function, right? Like after rehab, like rehabbing something, an injury. But then for you, Ione, it's kind of a similar thing, but for like the mind, right? Or social behavior, like someone who is trying to build that social emotional muscle, and virtual reality is kind of like a scaffolding or training program to build that neurological muscle. So I think that's pretty cool, and it speaks to how these technologies can be used to support us in skills, rehabbing, etc. Think about it too from another perspective. This is something that I discussed with professor of my text as data class. We got into a lot of discussions about, I think I brought his name up before, Morteza Degani. He introduced a paper to us, folks from Stanford. I think the citation was Park et al. 2023. And they actually used transformer-based language models like the chat GPTs. Like they made like 20 of them, put them in this virtual world, essentially, and let them interact with each other for like 2 days straight. And they built like a memory cognitive like architecture on top of the GPTs. So like the inputs and outputs had a way of creating memories and consolidating them in a very simplistic way. But what they found was these agents started interacting in very human-like ways, but also did things that had nothing to do with the prompts that they gave them, right? So I think the premise was like these agents were all going to attend a party of some kind, and a couple agents were like tasked with organizing it, but they had relationships with one another. So they started making plans that had nothing to do with the prompts, right? Like one agent was like, I know you have a crush on so-and-so, so I'll invite them to the party, and then you can ask them to coffee. And so the generative aspect was like, they were like human behaviors are being generated, right? When you kind of let these agents go. And I think that capacity for simulation could be really useful for modeling things like human behavior that are extremely complex, right? So if we want to pilot interventions or ways that experiments that we want to do that we couldn't be ethical or wouldn't be feasible to do with people, and these technologies can be another tool to use simulation to potentially learn or generate hypotheses or test hypotheses about human behaviors. I think that sounds like a really cool I don't have the technical knowledge to do any of that, but I thought it was really, really cool when I heard about it. So, Ione, I want to go back to something you mentioned. You mentioned EMA, and I know what that is, but can you break that down, define it, and tell us why it's useful for you and in your work?
Sure, I'll take my stab at this. So, ecological momentary assessment, EMA for short, is I think it's a broad term that really is trying to encapsulate the idea of doing intensive longitudinal assessments. Oftentimes, it can be very fine grained assessments that are happening just at several points in a day. It can happen over a course of days or weeks or months. And the idea is to really capture an assessment, in my case, for example, of behaviors, emotions, different kinds of regulation strategies that someone's doing in the moment at which that kind of survey is triggered. And so it's really nice because it can be these kind of really short surveys sent to someone's cell phone over a text or like an email. And really, at the moment that someone opens it, like, okay, what are you experiencing right at this moment? And it's a really neat way to capture these dynamic changes in these different kinds of variables that can give us a more not only intensive, but I think a more granular and in some cases, I think even just a more even sometimes like I think broader, but just like a more close to a reality view of these different variables. That's how I kind of see it, but I'm curious to, I mean, you do it in your work too, Gabe, right?
Yeah, we do part of my advisor's large study. I've helped to put together a small EMA portion where we have parents completing EMAs several days a week. We also collect data on sleep and physical activity. Yeah, so I think you broke it down very well, Ione. We're using the fact that people tend to have smartphones on them at all times, and if you don't have your smartphone on you, you feel like exposed, naked, like you need to always have it at your hip. So we try to take advantage of that and use it as an opportunity to learn about what people are feeling throughout the day, right? So you can send people prompts on a regular schedule. You can send them on a random schedule. You can make these prompts responsive to something that happens in the person's day, or maybe the person is asked to fill out one of these small surveys whenever something happens, a specific like stressor comes up or something like that, or they have a certain kind of social interaction. And yeah, the idea is like we can drop a pin in the middle of their day and hopefully get a more valid understanding of what people actually feel in their day-to-day lives rather than bringing them into the laboratory and giving them a large survey about how they felt about everything under the sun in the last 6 months or the last 2 weeks. And we know from research that people tend to be pretty poor assessors of their own mood and attitude retrospectively. The idea is that it'd be much better if we could ask people in the moment how they're feeling. And then if you do that multiple times over several days or weeks, then you can get a bigger picture about the word you used, Ione, was dynamics, right? The up and down fluctuations in how people are doing. Yeah, it's really interesting work. I guess I'm curious, Ione, if there's challenges that have come up for you in kind of doing this out in the wild type of research where you're gathering data in people's real lives. What challenges have you encountered?
So I think that there are a lot of choices that can go into figuring out how many times do you want to do it, how burdensome is it going to be to individuals. In the case of my lab, we're working with individuals who are experiencing clinical depression, and so it can be really hard to even get out of bed sometimes. So in order to ask them, like, can you fill out this survey 4 times today? Like that could be a lot to ask. But what we've seen is actually a lot of the expectations that I had going in have really not been too much of a concern. It's people are really motivated to contribute to the project. And it's really, if you're thinking about how short the surveys you want them to be, it's not too much to ask. Like someone can look at their phone and fill it out in a couple of minutes. And we've actually seen really good rates of just people filling them out, which has been great. But something that I have been thinking just like kind of behind the scenes though is how granular should we get? Because some of the changes, for example, in like a course of therapy, I don't know if I expect will change within a day. So if I teach someone a new therapy skill in one session, do I expect those changes to happen later that day, the next week? Might it be the next month? And when does it really matter? And if we go like too fine grained, I'm actually a little bit concerned. Like it sounds awesome to get all this data, but when Patrick Curran was actually visiting USC a couple of months ago, he mentioned this idea of like, wow, it's like really neat to get all this data, but sometimes the effects you see, you might just miss them. So for example, if you're testing out like a sink faucet and you want the water to get hot, you turn it all the way to hot put your hand under the water. It's not hot yet, right? So you turn it off. Like, okay, that was a failed faucet. Let me try that again. Water's not hot. So you turn it off. You try it again. And you're not really getting the full picture. You need to turn it on and wait a little bit for it to get hot. So I'm trying to figure out, what is the correct timing of assessments?
What are some of the things that you're specifically interested in measuring? Like what phenomena, what behaviors, what processes?
A lot of different ones throughout the course of therapy. So I'm really interested in seeing what is it the therapist might be teaching clients in session, and then what is the client actually kind of learning and then practicing out in their everyday life. How does that translate into cognitive changes, like changes in the way that they're thinking or reappraising situations, or even like behavioral changes, like are they changing the kinds of activities they're doing or the people they're connecting with? And then how does that then finally result in like symptom or affective changes? So trying to unpack all these different pieces. And I don't know if it's a direct kind of line either. It's more like I heard another kind of metaphor, like billiard balls. You hit one and then all of a sudden everything on the table shifts. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Most of the work that I've done, I've thought about, if you do EMA on multiple people that are interacting with one another, can you learn about how folks are having an impact on each other's mood and stress, right? Like, so right now we're collecting data on family sleep, their mood, and children's behavior as well. So you can kind of see, what is coming to bear on parents' mental health, for example. You can see things like a poor night's sleep, right? You can see things like what their child's behavior was like that day to kind of get an understanding of what are the actual causal dynamics for some of these things. And to the point you just mentioned, Ione, it was like everything's interconnected, right? So you can kind of see how a poor night's sleep leads to a rough day, maybe a fight with your spouse, which then could lead to a poor interaction with your child, right? Which then can capitulate into another poor night's sleep, right? So you can kind of see how folks can maybe get stuck in these periods of unhappiness or just periods where they're not thriving. And ideally, being able to collect this data in people's everyday lives can help you to understand those dynamics a little bit better. But yeah, to your point, it's always about matching the actual time course of the thing you're trying to study, right? Like I use exercise examples all the time, but if you get someone to come in the gym, you want them to build muscle, and you gather a ton of data on them in like a 7-day period, right? It's like, well, okay, you gathered a ton of data, but the thing you're measuring probably isn't going to change that much in 7 days, right? Maybe you take one measurement every week for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. Then you've now matched the way you're measuring this thing to the time course of what you want to study, which is, in this case, let's say building muscle. But to your point, Ione, maybe these things do happen kind of on a rapid basis. Like if someone does a behavior and we want to see what is their mood response after, it's probably important that we measure that right after they do that behavior or a strategy you teach them in therapy or whatnot. So these are questions that come up when I'm making these studies, but it leads me to another topic. And if you guys have other thoughts about EMA, I'm open to it. But what about like mental health apps, right? Like we talk about smartphones and like how smartphones can be used in research, but how can they be used to not only gather data, but actually like help people in their everyday lives? Do you guys have opinions on that, or have you guys done any work with that?
Yeah, so I've done a little bit. So I had a couple of studies where we were examining like an internet-based self-guided cognitive behavioral therapy intervention. And I think they have a lot of promise. I think that the skills we see are still can be pretty effective, but there are some other pieces that can be make it more challenging. So dropout rates can be pretty high, not having like some kind of support, whether that's in the form of even a kind of someone that's there to help give encouragement or provide reminders. Like there's something kind of neat about some kind of human support that can help people at least stay kind of committed to the intervention. Um, but outside of that, though, I do think that there are some questions as to what kind of apps are available. Because if you kind of search mental health app or app for anxiety, you're going to get hundreds of apps. And not all of these are rigorously tested. And so even if it might say a treatment intervention that sounds like, oh, yeah, that sounds pretty neat, like we actually don't know for a lot of them. So I would just say do research and kind of look for what's available because there are really great ones out there. But there's also, I think, just a lot of others too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Armin, I know this is more clinically oriented, but what are your thoughts as well about like this whole like industry of technology and psychology and mental health? Like, have you seen anything interesting in your work or in the collaborators you work with who have touched on these topics?
Yeah, yeah, so this is the topic of EMAs and all that is outside of my wheelhouse, but
Hmm.
it certainly learned a lot just listening to you two speak about it. Yeah, I think with the topic of like apps, I
Hmm.
guess, and things like that, I personally haven't heard too much about it, I guess, within my sphere of kind of like decision making. I know that there is a growing field of kind of like computational psychiatry, which is kind of trying to, I believe, kind of make the study of these kind of disorders a little bit more quantitative in terms of kind of finding patterns, I suppose, in the way the participants respond to certain things. But again, that's something that I'm not actively really working on, so I can't really go too deep into that. But I do have some experience with meditation apps.
Okay.
So I guess I can speak on that. When I was an undergrad here, I joined like a yoga club
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't through USC, just like a yoga studio down, I think on Hoover, like a little bit off campus. The club would just basically meet there. And through that, I was kind of introduced to like yoga and like meditation and everything. And I remember people would talk about this, that sort of like feeling you get, I guess, when you meditate. I don't know what it's called, but like we kind of just feel like weightless and just kind of like suspended in air
Hmm.
somewhat. I went into it because they talked about it and I was like, okay, like, yeah. And I distinctly remember like maybe like my third session or something there because they'd end it was like weekly and then you'd end the yoga with like a guided meditation. I still remember like that guided meditation, like it, you went for like 30 minutes. It felt like 5 minutes had gone by and like I left like just walking through and I just felt super, I guess like present, I guess is the word. I just felt very present and just in the moment. So anyway, I guess long story short, that led me to like trying to meditate more. And I found just some meditation apps on in the Apple App Store. And I don't remember what it was called. It was probably just one of the more popular ones. I didn't really filter it that well. But yeah, I think that experience has kind of shown me, I guess, the benefits of meditation for me specifically. And I also, really enjoyed the app. I don't use it anymore, but when I was getting into it, I found a lot of benefit in this sort of guided meditation approach. And yeah, I think I guess I could see the benefits for people who are just kind of stressed about certain things. And I think something, about these apps too is that it does take like a lot of like self kind of willpower to do it. I was just, I guess, kind of fortunate because I was kind of chasing that high, you could
Hmm.
call it, of wanting to like feel that like sort of like meditative feeling that I had. And yeah, I guess for me the experience was really beneficial. I guess it helped me kind of get more grounded somewhat and kind of be able to like refocus myself into the present moment. But yeah, I guess that's kind of my take on
Hmm.
these sorts of apps.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Armin. I think for a lot of folks may have similar experiences of finding an app that really they resonate with or it clicks with them or uh, they're able to learn something about practice of mindfulness or meditation. And it is interesting because kind of like both you alluded to, you can go onto an app store and find tons of different, technologies that you don't know what's been vetted by scientists or clinicians. And I know that's a big topic in both the research and the clinical worlds of how do we as professionals help to regulate or make sure that the products people are getting have some sort of evidence base behind them. I know people are still actively doing that work, but right now it's like the Wild West, right? It's like it's super unregulated. No one really knows what's gone into any kind of app. And a lot of people are trying to make money. So I'm interested to follow up on that as we as researchers continue to use technology that capitalizes on smartphones, computers, the virtual world, how that's going to mesh with industry, because I think inevitably it has to. That's where a lot of these products, the money and capital to make them, that's where a lot of it may come from. So I'm curious to see how that evolves during my career and others as well. Any other thoughts today, guys, before we wrap? I feel like we've had a few really cool topics come up today.
Yeah, I guess I have a very pessimistic view about standardized or like really scientifically backed sort of things.
Ooh.
I I don't I don't know if I see a future where that is something that is really, like a reality, because I think in not even just in the app space, but like across everything, in supplements, in like just books that people read because they want to learn more about certain topics, podcasts, just everything in general. I think a lot of the onus is up to the person to kind of do the vetting themselves, and that's kind of created this like sphere where unfortunately I think there are a lot of like bad actors who really just want to make money. So yeah, I guess for me it's like if there were certain apps backed by, like researchers and clinicians, that would be something that I would personally use. But yeah, I don't know if it's something that the general public would kind of flock to, so to say, especially if there's, somebody with more money and kind of more advertising power who can just kind of push their kind of app forward. Yeah, it's just, I guess I'm pessimistic because I think it would require a very big kind of structural shift in kind of how things are done. But the tech landscape is evolving, and specifically with AI and ChatGPT, there's a lot of just infighting, I guess you could call it, with AI researchers. There's like a large group of AI researchers who are pushing for more control, more like regulation. And then there's another group who, the opposite, they want everything to be like open source and kind of free for everyone to use. And, it's not the same as kind of what you were bringing up, but I think it kind of echoes a similar theme of, there's just these two camps of people who can identify the problem and want there to be some sort of change. And then there's another group of people who just seems to just want to just progress no matter what. So yeah, I'm interested to see how it evolves as well.
I feel like that's setting up a really good part two. I would love to come back because I have to run, but this is like, that's an very interesting topic to me. Kind of this trade-off between regulation and innovation in the mental health space, or the health space more generally, meshing with technology, right? I'd love to bring us back for a part two for this discussion. But,
Yeah, I also would love to continue this conversation.
yeah,
Sure,
'cause this
sorry,
is
yeah.
like, no, that's, yeah. So listeners, tune in again for part two of technology and research. But we appreciate everyone listening, and we're signing off for today.
This is Psych Overflow signing off. Thank you for listening.
Be sure to subscribe to our podcast for future episodes, and don't hesitate to reach out to us with your feedback, questions, or topic suggestions.
See you next time.